Imagine being a child, sitting in a cold room, your hands shaking as you tell adults the worst thing that's ever happened to you. You've been told to tell the truth, that justice will protect you. But deep down, you know something's off. You can see it in their eyes. They don't believe you. Now imagine growing up and realizing that the people who were supposed to defend you didn't just ignore you. They protected the man who hurt you. That's not a movie. That's what happened. And today, Congress is finally confronting the man who made that decision, Alexander Acosta. And what he's saying under oath is shocking. When Acosta was first questioned about the infamous Epstein case, many hoped he'd finally acknowledge what everyone already knew, that the deal his office made was one of the biggest failures of justice in modern history.
The decision to have given Mr. Epstein a sweetheart deal, which was only 18 months, and which during that time he went on to abuse multiple women that he raped during that time, where he was supposed to, of course, have been in jail via team by Acosta. Let me also just add, which I think is really important. In his questioning, he also agreed and stood by those decisions and would not claim any responsibility to the victims, and in fact said and was admitted that he had no knowledge of what happened to those victims, even to this day, when asked directly if he actually knew that people were being abused, that women were abused during that time. He would not admit that he knew that information and actually refused to acknowledge the victims. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ms. Crockett, and everyone's going to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ranker. And I think I want to pick up on where Congressman Garcia left off. It is this idea that he is not experiencing what most of us experience, which is that hindsight is 20/20. He seems to be pretty dug in on the decisions that he made. And so for me, obviously, I wanted to dig in a little bit and try to ascertain why is it that he felt so confident. And unfortunately, I heard things that disturbed me, such as, well, back in 2006, it was a different time. And it seemed as if we were going back to a little bit of victim shaming and believing that, well, nobody's going to believe these girls or these women, so we're not going to necessarily have a good case. And so instead of rolling the dice, or I don't remember, I think it was a crapshoot was what was said, instead of taking a crapshoot, we just decided that this would be better and this may guarantee that he actually spent some time in custody. Think about that. Think about the responsibility that is upon a prosecutor to go after a child predator and then to say, well, at the end of the day, we don't think they would have been believed. As someone who has been in these courtrooms, who has had to defend against these very types of cases, let me tell you something. And I did try to educate him on the experts that we have that can lay out whether or not a child has any inconsistencies as it relates to the trauma that they have experienced. It doesn't seem like either Mr. Acosta was equipped to be the U.S. attorney at that time, or he's just playing in our faces. I haven't really figured out which one, but neither one of these ultimate conclusions should be okay for the American people.
Hello, Brandon. Congressman Maxwell for us. I 100% agree with what Congresswoman Crockett just said. Mr. Acosta, at least to us in this deposition, essentially said he didn't have faith in the victims, their stories, and their ability to tell their own story and their own testimony, which is deeply disturbing to all of us sitting in there. Not just that, but it seems like Mr. Acosta really had no idea about what was going on in his own office during this investigation, during the deliberation on this, on what is the most high-profile case that his office handled during that time period, which is also a very disturbing fact, given all the other cases that they handle as well. There's going to be more questions, but something else we also talked about was his time in being considered to be Secretary of Labor, another place where he didn't have much information to give us, didn't have much recollection of specific questions that the administration might have asked him about the Epstein case when they were vetting him and considering him to be on the president's cabinet. He did not have much for us there. He gave some, some things he thought he maybe could have remembered, and I think it was just deflection. And so there'll be more questions around this. But as we know, to this day, when he resigned being Secretary of Labor, he still contends that it's had nothing to do with this case. And I think we all know much better than that. Thank you.
Right. Well, good morning. I'm Melanie Stansbury, and I represent New Mexico's 1st Congressional District. I want to lay out some key facts for you all. It is our understanding from the victims' attorneys that there were at least 40 minors who gave sworn statements to the FBI as part of the investigation before a decision was made in this case that they had been raped, abused, and trafficked. Over 40 minors. And the line prosecutor in this case wrote an 82-page memo to the leadership in the U.S. Attorney's Office recommending a prosecution. And she was so convinced based on the evidence and interviews that she had taken and reviewed, that she drafted a 53-page indictment in this case. And what Mr. Acosta just told us is that based on his assessment of the case with his team, that he did not see sufficient evidence to move forward with prosecuting the case, that there were weaknesses in the case. When asked if he made the decision as to whether or not to fully prosecute this case, he took responsibility for it. He said it was the decision of him and his team. But when asked if he had directly reviewed the evidence itself in this case, he said that he had not actually read the statements of the victims. So let me just say this. Something doesn't smell right here. We have a number of hours that we will be spending today to understand what and if Mr. Acosta understood the full scope of the evidence, what he used to make his decisions, and why he chose, instead of pursuing a prosecution in which we know there were at least 40 minors and afterwards there were many more victims during the non-prosecution period, why he made that decision. And so we will be pursuing that in the coming hours.
But instead of remorse, what came out was denial, deflection, and a stunning lack of empathy for the victims whose lives were shattered. He wouldn't even admit the obvious, that Epstein received a sweetheart deal. He stood by it. 18 months behind bars, with daily work release privileges. Privileges he used to continue meeting with women while supposedly in custody. It wasn't just leniency, it was complicity disguised as procedure. And even now, when asked about what happened to those victims, Acosta said he didn't know. He didn't know? This wasn't some lost paperwork. These were living, breathing people who came forward, whose pain was documented, recorded, and ignored. That's where the hearing turned. You could feel the room tighten. Lawmakers stopped treating this like a policy discussion and started treating it like what it truly was, a reckoning. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped in, and she didn't waste time. She pointed out something chilling. Acosta wasn't acting like a man who made a tragic mistake. He was acting like a man who still believed he did the right thing. When Crockett asked him why he was so confident in a decision that let a predator walk free, his answer said everything about how broken the system was back then. He said that in 2006, it was a different time. Think about that. A different time. As if the basic moral obligation to protect children somehow expired 2 decades ago, Crockett pressed further. She revealed that Acosta and his team decided not to prosecute fully because they didn't think the victims would be believed. He even called it a crapshoot. That word, casually tossed into testimony, speaks volumes. It wasn't about evidence or truth. It was about reputation, about comfort, about not wanting to roll the dice on the credibility of traumatized young girls. Crockett, who's worked in courtrooms herself, didn't let that slide. She explained that experts can and do testify about trauma, about why survivors might have inconsistencies in their stories. That's normal, not disqualifying. But Acosta didn't seem to care. Either he was unequipped to understand that reality, or he simply chose not to. And as Crockett said bluntly, either way, that's unacceptable. The next voice came from Congressman Maxwell Frost, and his frustration was written all over his words. He said what millions of people watching were thinking. Acosta didn't just fail those victims. He never believed them to begin with. Frost called it deeply disturbing that a U.S. attorney, leading one of the highest profile cases in his district, didn't seem to know what was happening in his own office. He didn't follow up on evidence, didn't ensure accountability, didn't seem to care about the outcome. And yet, years later, he still claimed that his team did the right thing. It wasn't just negligence. It was detachment on a level that defies belief. And then, as if the hearing hadn't already been jaw-dropping, Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury from New Mexico took the floor and laid out facts that silenced the room. According to the victims' attorneys, at least 40 minors gave sworn statements to the FBI. 40, each one telling their story of being trafficked, abused, and manipulated. The line prosecutor in Acosta's office, the one actually doing the work, wrote an 82-page memo recommending full prosecution. She even drafted a 53-page indictment. She believed in the evidence so strongly that she was ready to go to trial. But Acosta said no. He claimed the case had weaknesses. When Stansbury asked him directly whether he had even read the victim's statements, his answer was no. He hadn't. Let that sink in. He didn't read them. A U.S. attorney made the most consequential decision of his career based on secondhand summaries and assumptions. And the price of that choice was paid by dozens of victims who would never see their abuser held accountable. At this point, the story stopped being about one case and became something much bigger, a window into how justice can fail when power and privilege interfere. Acosta's explanation revealed a mindset that goes beyond one man. It exposed a system willing to protect the powerful even if it means sacrificing the vulnerable. By claiming the case wasn't strong enough, Acosta echoed the same arguments we've heard for decades, that victims, especially young women, are unreliable, emotional, or confused. It's a narrative that has shielded predators for generations. And this hearing was pulling that shield apart piece by piece. But the most disturbing part wasn't just the failure. It was what came after. Acosta wasn't punished for that decision. He was rewarded. He rose higher. He became Secretary of Labor, the person responsible for protecting American workers, including victims of exploitation and trafficking. When Congress asked him during the vetting process what the administration knew about his past handling of the Epstein case, he suddenly had memory issues. I don't recall. I don't remember. I don't have that information. The pattern repeated. Deflection, denial, distance. When he eventually resigned amid mounting pressure, he still insisted his decision had nothing to do with the case that defined him. But everyone watching knew better. The timing said it all. And that's what makes this hearing different. Because this isn't just about one official or one criminal case. It's about accountability. It's about asking how a man who ignored dozens of victims could climb the ladder of power instead of being held responsible. It's about how systems of privilege operate quietly behind the scenes, rewriting narratives and erasing consequences. Acosta's answers didn't just reveal a personal failure. They exposed a culture that values power over truth. The more you listen, the clearer it becomes that this is not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a larger problem. How institutions deal with trauma, especially when the victims are young, female, or not in positions of influence. Trauma-informed approaches aren't just buzzwords, they're necessities. Experts have said for years that victims' testimonies may seem inconsistent precisely because of the trauma they've endured. The brain protects itself by fragmenting memory, by blocking details that are too painful to recall. But instead of understanding that, the justice system often uses it against them, just like Acosta did. That's not justice. That's systemic failure. This hearing matters because it forces those failures into the light. Every revelation, every line of testimony, is a reminder that behind every decision in a courtroom are real people, children, families, survivors, whose lives are forever shaped by what those in power decide. And when those decisions are based on disbelief or political convenience, the consequences ripple through generations. How many other cases have been quietly swept aside because someone thought the victims wouldn't be believable? How many more powerful figures have walked free because a prosecutor didn't want to take a crapshoot? The numbers may be higher than anyone wants to admit. That be why this point in the video, viewers should feel the weight of that question. Because this isn't just history. This is happening now, in different forms, with different names, but the same underlying pattern. Institutions that promise protection often end up protecting themselves. And every time that happens, public trust erodes a little more. It's why hearings like this matter. They're not about scoring political points. They're about exposing how easily justice can be manipulated when no one's watching. As the hearing continues, it's clear the members of Congress aren't backing down. Crockett, Frost, and Stansbury are demanding answers that should have been given years ago. They're asking the questions that so many victims never got the chance to ask. Why weren't we believed? Why didn't you fight for us? Why did you protect him instead of protecting us? And the fact that these questions are being asked now, on record, in public, under oath, is a small but crucial step toward accountability. It's also a moment of reckoning for viewers. Because if the justice system can fail in a case as public as this, what happens to the cases that never make headlines? What happens to the victims who don't have lawyers, or the ones whose stories never reach Congress? That's why this story matters. It's not about reliving a scandal. It's about understanding the machinery of silence that allows powerful people to keep escaping consequences. It's about learning how those mechanisms work, so we can dismantle them. By now, you can probably sense the shift in tone. What started as a hearing about one man's decisions has become a moral conversation about what kind of justice system we want to live under. A system that excuses failure because of different times or uncertain evidence? Or one that stands firmly with victims, no matter how inconvenient the truth may be? The choice isn't theoretical. It's the foundation of public trust. And that's why this isn't just an episode to watch and move on from. It's a wake-up call. When power protects power, it's up to ordinary people to keep demanding answers. When institutions lose credibility, transparency becomes the only way forward. The public must stay engaged, asking questions, watching hearings, refusing to let stories like this fade away once the headlines move on. Because let's be honest, the damage done by decisions like Acosta's can't be undone. The victims can't get back what they lost. But what can happen is change. Real change. A justice system that listens, that believes, that protects the vulnerable instead of the powerful. That's the goal. And it starts by remembering that accountability isn't a political issue. It's a human one that if you've watched this far, you already know how important this conversation is. What happened here wasn't an accident. It was a choice. One that revealed how fragile justice becomes when comfort and power are prioritized over truth. But awareness is power too. The more people understand how these systems fail, the harder it becomes for them to hide behind excuses. So if this story moved you, if it made you angry or heartbroken or even just aware, don't let it stop here. Share this video to keep the conversation going. Subscribe for ongoing coverage of these hearings and stories that expose how power really works behind the scenes. Because justice doesn't defend itself, people do. And every time we choose to stay informed, to speak out, to demand accountability, we make it harder for the next powerful person to hide behind silence. Stay curious, stay aware, and most of all, stay loud. Because truth only wins when enough people refuse to look away. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe accountability shouldn't depend on who you are. It should depend on what's right.